Welcome to CU. I'm Michael Ignatieff, Rector and President, and we have a lot of distinguished people in the audience, some very distinguished representatives of the diplomatic corps in Budapest, from Ireland, from Germany, from Denmark, from Sweden, from other places. If I've neglected any nation who's represented here, please forgive me. But we welcome representatives from the diplomatic community particularly and thank them for their, we believe we provide a postgraduate education for the diplomatic corps in Hungary, and we're delighted to do so, as well as for our own students who are here, for our faculty and staff. This is, I've lost count of the number of lectures we've had in the Rethinking Open Society series, which was an attempt on our part to take a internal debate about who we are and what we stand for as a university and take it out to a wider community. It turned out to be more relevant than we could have imagined, because the values of open society are not the monopoly or preserve of Central European University. A critical debate about what those values mean and entail in the 21st century belongs to everybody, belongs to Hungarians, belongs to our European and North American colleagues, and that's been the purpose, and we are especially pleased tonight to raise another issue in the debate about the future of open society, and that's the role of, obviously, no offense to other European partners in the room, the most powerful and important state in Europe, Germany. One of the issues that is now at the center of European politics and will be at the center of European politics for a very long time is the attitude of the Federal Republic towards the future of open society in Europe. This was a question we did not ask in the 90s. We assumed simply that open societies, meaning various forms of liberal constitutionalism, would spread inevitably across Europe, and Europe would be the home of a certain kind of experiment in democratic freedom that was simply, we could take it for granted. But now we're in a different situation. One that we have to think about, and it poses policy challenges not just for the Federal Republic, but for all European and also North American states. And we're very, very lucky to have Daniela Schwarzer with us. Daniela is the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. She's been a member of the executive team of the German Marshall Fund. She has had important roles at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She's also been a journalist with the FT. It's hard to think of a more influential or more thoughtful commentator on German foreign policy and the future of Europe. And she's come from Berlin to talk to us. She says there's less snow in Berlin than in Budapest, but we are extremely delighted that she can be here. For those of you unfamiliar with our format, she'll talk for a while and then we'll sit down and have a chat, and then I hope we will get questions from the audience, and the event will end very sharply at 7 o'clock, after which there will be Pogacz. Yeah. Right there, next door. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Daniela Schwarzer, whose topic is Germany and the Fate of Open Society in Europe.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this very kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here tonight. My first time speaking at CEU, but I've been watching the success of this university from not too far away from Berlin. And I've been in touch with a number of your colleagues in various projects, and I appreciate the work you're doing here. Now, you have given me a topic, Germany and the Fate of Open Society in Europe, which has three moving pieces. One of them is Germany, and I'll start out with that, and then I will come to the point where I speak about the future of Europe and obviously also about open society. I guess half a year back, we wouldn't really have imagined that German politics would be that interesting, and that the country that many saw as being the leader of the EU and more recently actually the leader of the West since Donald Trump became president of the US would actually be in a political situation where we don't know when and which government we will have. Now, we are kind of on the finishing line already, because we will know next Sunday whether the Social Democrats will have approved of the coalition treaty, and then we will know if it's a yes, what's happening. If it's a no, it will remain very interesting. So I'd like to do three things in my talk. The first one is I would like to discuss, because I think there's a lot of continuity, where Germany will be going with its foreign and European policy. I would then secondly like to comment on the German leadership role in Europe over the past years and what we can learn from both what has been happening, but also from the expectation that have been projected upon Germany. And then the third point will be a discussion, and this is really points for the then debate with all of you, what can possibly be done from the perspective of Berlin to engage more actively for open society in Europe. Now, where is Germany going? If the Social Democrats decide to go into the Grand Coalition, I expect a policy on EU affairs which is in continuity with the last Grand Coalition, which is still acting, but which is going to be more ambitious. Why do I believe that? Because it is in Germany's profound interest that the EU remains a stable context of German policymaking, both within the EU, the single market, and the fact that Brexit is leaving is much to the regret of very many Germans, but also because Germany looks at the EU as the prism through which it likes to think about its foreign policy. Obviously also NATO for defense, but if you look back at the foreign policy review that our previous foreign minister Steinmeier conducted in the Foreign Office, where he really asked very fundamental questions, not only about German interests, but also about German strategy, it really emerged from all pieces that Germany continues to think, when it thinks foreign policy, most closely with its partners and through the prism of the European Union. And I would argue the more unstable our neighborhood has become, both to Europe's east and to Europe's south, the more there is a recognition in Berlin that we need to work together to stabilize our neighboring countries. And as we see external influences coming into the EU and partially really aiming at destabilizing liberal democracy within the European Union, this interest has grown even further. Then there is, of course, stability of interest because of our economic situation. We are a country which greatly benefits both from the single market and from the euro as the single currency, a country which has greatly benefited from the fact that the EU has enlarged towards Central and Eastern Europe. This is an important context for German economic success. And hence, all the splits that are now sort of projected as being the challenges for the EU, both the North-South divide and the East-West divide, are something that German policymakers are very concerned about. And I think here is a learning process which Germany has gone through. The first one is the process triggered by the Eurozone crisis, mostly the sovereign debt and banking crisis, and the handling of this challenge. It was the first time since 2010, when the sovereign debt crisis hit the Eurozone, that Germans actually saw how polarizing their positions were and how much political pressure Germany was, first of all, exerting on others, but was also getting back. And the tensions that were emerging also, not only in political encounters, but also in the media, between Germany and Greece, for instance, just to pick two, the extent of public naming and shaming and the harsh words found in the press in each of the two countries, that was a shock to many. Because it showed that what we thought was sort of the political culture of the EU maybe wasn't that stable, and that polarization and blaming, and I'm not excluding the Germans here in any way, it was a mutual process, that this could be unleashed very quickly. The second learning was that not all the policies that Germany firmly believed in were the right policies for Southern Europe actually turned out to be as successful as they were expected to be. And again here, there is an extent of correction that is slowly being made. And the third learning was, and that's very closely connected to the first two, it's not only about keeping the euro together, but it was also about maintaining stability both in political and in social terms in EU member states. Now, 1 or 2 years back, I remember a conversation with a Secretary of State from the Foreign Office who at the time said, we understand from the German perspective on Southern Europe, something has to give. And I believe that since then, the reflection process in Berlin has moved on as to be able to answer what is it that we are willing and able to give in order to rebuild consensus and compromise and to keep the Eurozone together in a sustainable way. If you look at the coalition treaty, you will see, first of all, there are no red lines. And I think that is the best news. Because if there were options excluded for the deepening of the Eurozone, that would be bad. There are not too many details, but I would say it is positive to see, first of all, the readiness, if we get the grand coalition, the readiness of political leaders to say we are willing to pay more for Europe, so a potential increase of the German contribution to the EU budget. We understand that the Eurozone needs particular tools in order to maintain the functioning of the euro, but also economic and social stability within the currency union. So these are important movements forward, and we don't yet have the government, I believe, but I believe it will be spelled out, in particular because France has put the cards on the table and has made important proposals to which Germany to date hasn't answered. Now, the second divide that Berlin is increasingly worried about is the so-called East-West divide. Obviously, I would think it is completely wrong to classify the East and the West. But what I see emerging in the political exchange, or in the exchange with policymakers I have in Berlin, is a growing concern that at least some countries in Central and Eastern Europe are backsliding on democracy, are questioning Western liberal norms, are implementing reforms that undermine open society. And I would say that in Berlin, the laws table, or the law tabled by Viktor Orban on this precise university, was a wake-up call. And it was much debated in Berlin. And I think a consensus that emerged at that time was, this is not about Hungary and a particular problem within Hungary, but it is to some extent about the credibility of Europe. Whether we can watch a university which subscribes to the norms of open society and Western liberalism, that this is being closed, and we just watch. So I think that was an important moment last year around this time where the political discourse in Germany changed. Now, Berlin, I think, is still in a position where it firmly believes that the maximum needs to be done to bridge both divides, the north-south and the east-west divide, if they exist in those clear and easy terms. Obviously, we know it's much more complicated. But there is a difference here between the thinking in Germany and some other countries, and I would at this point include France to that. Germany thinks the future of the EU predominantly as the EU 27, and I gave you the reasons why this is so. There are other governments who are ready to more quickly jump to a thinking of let's move forward in smaller groups. And we've heard several policymakers actually suggest that if some countries, like Poland or like Hungary, don't wish to any longer subscribe to the values and norms of democratic governance that the EU is built upon, that they could just leave the EU. This is something that, at least the people I talk to in Berlin, are very worried about. Because, first of all, there is really no interest to see the EU breaking apart. And secondly, obviously, this additional polarization is not helpful to making progress together in the European Union. Now, Germany at this point, as we all know, is not only in a situation where it doesn't have a government, but whenever we have a new government, it will be faced with very, very high expectations as to its leadership role. And part of the reason why this is so is what we have seen happening in Europe over the past years. I mentioned the Eurozone crisis as a moment where Germany was actually able to pretty much, obviously always in partnership with others, but was able to define the terms of crisis management to a large extent, being the largest financial contributor. It was seen as a country taking the lead in the handling of the migration crisis in a way that led to a lot of criticism and ensuing polarization. And it was also seen as the country which, together with France, took the leadership role for Europe in one of the major foreign policy challenges over the past few years, which is the confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, and in particular the annexation of Crimea. Now, there are as many expectations as there is criticism of the potential German role in Europe going forward. I spoke about the learnings that I see have happened in Berlin and the acute awareness that it is part of Germany's task to balance the various interests within the European Union and then try to incrementally build consensus and move ahead. But this complexity of the picture and the difference of national interests that are emerging, and in particular the new and stronger discourse on national sovereignty and on bringing certain competencies back to member states, is something that Berlin policymakers are aware of and worried about. So while I see high expectations wherever I go as to German leadership, I think the debate in Berlin is still very much on what can we actually move and what is the responsibility we have to take. At this point, I would say this notion of responsibility is most debated in the area of security and defense. And you all know about the criticism of Germany not doing enough in terms of defense investment, procurement, its engagement in NATO, and now in the recently created European Structured Defense Cooperation, PESCO. So I think there is a strong will to engage, and Germany has committed to increasing defense expenditure, and we will see how the new government handles the balance it is carefully striking in the coalition treaty of spending, if you add expenditure, add as much on defense as on development policy. But the other area where Germany has taken a leadership role and may decide so if when the new government is in place, is in fact some kind of normative leadership. If you look at how Chancellor Merkel reacted to Donald Trump on various occasions, reminding the US president on the fundamental values that also the transatlantic relationship and partnership is built upon, you could see how very quickly Germany was positioned as the leader of the West. I don't think anyone in Berlin wants to be the leader of the West, but it wants to co-lead the West with other partners. In terms of European policy, I hope that the new government will pay a lot of attention to the issue of challenging democracy and open society in some countries of the EU, that this is something that needs the highest degree of political attention, simply because the European Union as such doesn't have, at this point, tools that actually seem to work to prevent backsliding democracy within the European Union. Now, one reflection that is ongoing in Brussels, in Berlin, elsewhere, is how incentives can be provided to countries who have moved away from democratic norms that they had implemented when they joined the European Union. And here, the discussion on the future of the EU budget is interesting. Very hard to implement, of course, because you need unanimity to change the functioning of the multi-annual financial framework of the EU. But the question indeed is if certain expenditures can be linked to the respect of the rule of law, for instance, the fight against corruption. This is a broad issue for the European Union, and I hope that the German government, which has leverage, of course, being the largest contributor to the EU budget, uses when the negotiations come to full speed in the next coming month. The second task from a German perspective, in my view, is to keep up and maybe even increase the engagement with societies in other EU member states. As you know, Germany runs a pretty, I would say, powerful and impactful network of political foundations, which are present in many EU member states and abroad, which are a very good platform to engage in a broader dialogue than just governments have with each other. And so the exchange through those foundations, but also through other actors of civil society, going obviously in particular to the younger generation, encouraging mobility and encounters across European borders, in my view, is something not only a country like Germany, but the EU as a whole can invest more in and be more proactive on. And the third task I would see for Germany is not only to engage on the governmental level with our partners in the European Union, but to do even more for parliamentary exchange. If I take the example of Hungary, and there's one member of parliament which I'm very pleased to see, Zsuzsa, maybe you have comments on that, the engagement that parliamentarians need to take. And here we have a specific situation with the current government in Hungary being part of the European People's Party. If we had a stronger exchange between parliamentarians, including from the German side Christian Democrats, to discuss issues of open society and backsliding democracy, I think this could possibly be an extra and powerful way of deepening the discussion we need to have in Europe as a whole. I would like to leave it here for my opening remarks, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with you, Michael.